Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Please listen to this episode at your discretion. Sex, a topic filled with taboos. Sex education still remains limited, and our exposure to sex and sexuality growing up is also heavily distorted. In this context, perhaps, how is sex depicted within Indian epics? How does it compare to depictions from elsewhere? Authors Devi Yesodharan and Samhita Arni join us on BIC Talks to explore this topic. Hi Sam, welcome back to BIC Talks and congratulations on winning the New Book Award for The Prince.
Thank you so much, Pavan, and I'm so excited to be here.
Hi Devi, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Pavan. I'm glad to be here as well.
And the floor is entirely yours.
So this chat that Sam and I are doing is about sex in literature and epics. So when we were initially discussing doing this chat, we were wondering if it's too A-rated for a general audience and so on. But fortunately, BIC came to our rescue and agreed to host this chat. So here we are. One of the reasons we considered doing this at all was because the way that we talk about sex is very skewed in India right now. And there is very little conversation, I think, that actually happens around the value of sex in literature. So literature shows us, I think, who we are. It holds up a view of humanity that is not photoshopped, unlike a lot of things are today. It helps us come to terms with not just our triumphs, but also our humiliations. And in many ways, it is our truest mirror. Now, I believe sex is a big part of that. It is a part of life that brings with it romantic engagement, rejection, and vulnerability. And it is also that huge tidal wave that carries us, from childhood to adulthood. And it changes us in fundamental ways. It ends up reshaping our personalities. As we all know, it also changes our relationships with our family and friends and so on. But when it actually comes to the actual experience, I think Indians have a very narrow, extreme experience when it comes to sex. For example, we often encounter sex first with pornography. We have moved from what I see as the over-sanitization of the immediate post-colonial period when there was a very Victorian chichi happening around discussing and talking about sex to what is now very easily accessible internet porn. And I think it has become a very standard experience where boys encounter sex first through all-flavor sites like RedTube, while girls encounter it through both porn and stories, that come through Mills and Boons and Regency novels. In fact, this sort of gender split is very apparent, I think, everywhere. Even in Western nations where high-speed internet access is available to both men and women at fairly similar rates, you tend to see that the audience for sites like RedTube is skewed towards men at around 70 to 75%, while the readers of romantic literature are around 80% women. The thing, though, is that if we only encounter sex in these very extreme flavors, these very crude sort of basic ways, we are essentially grasping the dark and missing out on understanding a very foundational part of ourselves. This is my theory. Engaging and thinking about sex sort of frightens us because our superego has very limited control over our desires. As people, we don't get to choose what we desire. And in that way, it's sort of very uniquely revealing about us. And good writers can therefore use sex to show people at their best as well as their worst, because it's so difficult to have control over that part. It shows people their jealousies, their selfishness, as well as their generosity. So overall, I think the question is not, should we acknowledge it? It's actually about how do we acknowledge it and how do we move from the stage one of voyeurism and porn to, good writing. What do you think, Sam? Do you think this is like one way to look at it?
Absolutely. And I like so much how you really discussed how the way we approach sex seems to be so very gendered. One is very visual and the other one is we read about it very in terms of in literature. And I think both experiences condition us, especially when you're young, when you're attempting your first own sexual experience and your first sexual relationship. Both what we read and what we watch condition our expectations in so many ways that are deeply problematic and actually truly inhibit that expression of intimacy, inhibit that understanding of our own personal and private selves that you just spoke of. And I think one thing that you said, we've been talking about this for a very long time. This has been an ongoing discussion for us that we're now making public. But what I remember you bringing up in earlier conversations was also the importance of thinking about sex as a rite of passage. And that line has really stuck with me. It's just so perceptive what you said, Devi, because I think in these times, we don't have ceremonies that so much mark the transition from childhood to adulthood anymore. Graduation ceremonies, yes, but I don't know how much kind of personal transformative importance that we put on that. What is actually far more transformative, and that seems to be that marker in a person's life, is their first experience of actual sex. It's that crossing of that threshold where you're moving into the hero's journey. You are understanding that deeper aspect of yourself. You are expressing yourself in different ways. And I think that first time, that first night, that's all become that in the kind of narratives we talk about and what we see. That in some ways, sex is also a kind of means for self-transformation. So I think that's also something that we need to pay attention to in discussions of sex in literature and understanding their importance. And I think something else that you really touched upon here was also how sex reveals character, particularly when we write about it. The way you think about sex or the way you write about sex can often reveal that subconscious repressed aspect of the character that you're trying to reveal. So sex can be deeply revealing in that way too.
Absolutely. And even though we're talking about sex in literature and epics today, which is a far more respectable topic compared to Mills and Boon's and Regency novels, I have to admit that my first reading was this Mills and Boon's book that was there in my mother's shelf that I found sort of stashed away, which was called The Unwilling Bridegroom. So it was nothing close to literature. It was quite a seamy story. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the idea that love has to be characterized by this intense passion. It's not always the healthiest thing, that the relationship you go for is the sexiest one. I'm not also necessarily sure that's the best relationship choice young people should be making today.
So one of the first such texts in ancient literature I wanted to talk about, and the reason I think it's useful to also talk about epics, is that we tend to see that the Indian ancients had a very different perception of sex compared to what we do. They sort of very easily braided it into their literature and stories. And you can find that in our epics. They're full of feelings and different perspectives about sex. And it was even part of communion with God. So you see it in a lot of bhakti poetry and so on. So one of the first such texts in ancient Indian literature I read was Kalidasa's 5th century court epic, Kumārasambhava, which is the birth of Kumara. So there is a great translation by Hank Heifetz, which is published by Penguin, which was the first version that I read, and that is available for purchase online as well. And so Kalidasa in this epic speaks about the events leading up to the birth of Kumara, who is the demon slayer who will kill Taraka. Now Taraka is this demon who has been terrorizing Indra and the other gods. And Kumārasambhavam essentially talks about the events that lead up to Kumara's birth. It's the sort of courtship that happens before the marriage of Shiva and Parvati, as well as the subsequent marriage. And it is an epic that is full of sexual tension and romance. And you will find great details here that have persisted even in modern Indian movie love scenes. There is a scene, for example, that involves Parvati getting wet in the rain. And Kalidasa is this great visual poet, and he uses that skill to great effect while he's describing Parvati's beauty. For example, the verse that I was talking about, Kalidasa is describing Parvati doing tapas in the rain to get Shiva's attention. So he describes, the rain falling on her. The lines go something like this. So the first drops of rain rested on her eyelashes, struck her lower lip, broke up on the heights of her breasts, then slipping down over the 3 delicate folds of her belly, slowly reached her navel. So she's sitting there in the rain, essentially quoting Shiva, and he describes her homeless in the months of rain, and the nights are watching her with these open eyes of lightning. So I found it very interesting that he goes into so much description of her beauty as well as her persistence, because there were these 2 interesting parts that struck me regarding the sexuality of the poem. So one is that the quoting is done by the woman. In this case, Parvati is pursuing Shiva and wants him as a husband, and she's fairly relentless over, several pages. She's not giving up. And the second interesting detail I thought was, worth mentioning here is that Parvati is not punished here for her desire by the storyteller. In fact, her boldness is celebrated, unlike what you see so often in classical Western literature. And Shiva and Parvati emerge as this very famously sort of sexual couple in the Sanskrit canon. And you see some of the oldest sculptures of them in temples have Parvati either sitting on his lap or, resting her head very casually against his shoulder. And in the poem itself, in Kumārasambhava, after she wins him over, there is a whole sarga of the poem that is dedicated to the description of Parvati's sexual pleasure. For example, it takes days for Shiva to convince Parvati to be comfortable with him. So there is none of this first night business. And the other interesting thing I observed was that the cantos involving Shiva and Parvati actually having sex have a special meter called the Rathodata, which refers to the sort of bumping up and down of the carriage, which is a simulation of two people having sex, basically. And the reference that Kalidasa makes to Parvati sitting on Shiva's lap is actually sort of repeated across these temple sculptures. So the verse goes something like this: "And the splendor of her hips can be measured by how Shiva at last would lift them to his lap, and there faultless she would rest, where even the desires of other women cannot go." And this is the depiction you will see where Parvati is sitting on Shiva's lap and he has his arm encircling her waist. And it is a very affectionate public display of intimacy of a couple. And since we're talking about these embraces, I also wanted to mention two kinds of embraces which are 1,000 years apart. So I think many of us have seen this very famous sculpture by the artist Rodin titled The Kiss, which is based on the poet Dante's poem, The Divine Comedy. And the couple here is in a sort of similar pose. The woman is sitting on the man's lap, half off, half on, and they're kissing really passionately. But the difference here, I think, is that this particular kiss is like a stolen, unfaithful one. Both these people were married to somebody else. And Francesca, the girl in the sculpture, is actually kissing Paolo, who's her brother-in-law. And eventually this couple is killed by the outraged husband when he finds out. And I think it's an interesting difference between these two sculptures, where Shiva and Parvati's kiss is a celebration of intimacy, while the other one is like a tragedy and a cautionary tale. And it tells you so much of how much of an imprint a writer can leave on, a depiction of love and sensuality and so on.
Devi, that was amazing to hear you talk about that, because in some ways I feel like the past, in many respects, especially when it comes to women's agency, seems to be far more progressive than the present. When you were talking about Rodin, the other image that came to mind was that very famous V-Day image of a kiss, right? There's, I think, a sailor who grabs a woman off the street, bends her to the point where she looks like she's going to break her spine and kisses her. And that has become this moment that has captured not just victory, but also romance for us. And the truth behind that image is deeply disturbing. He just grabbed a woman off the street and kissed her. That's aggressive. That is non-consensual. And yet all of those kinds of ideas, that has defined romance for us in these present times. Whereas what you're talking about with Parvati and Kumārasambhava, it seems far more consensual. There is a woman leading this process, and it is her pleasure also, and the actual wooing of her and quelling of her fears that seems to be so much of a part of that process. It's almost astonishing that we have regressed in certain respects.
So much so, right? It's almost considered unnecessary to think about the woman's pleasure or her enjoyment of the whole thing.
I think the other thing that's really interesting to compare Kumārasambhava and the story of Parvati and Shiva with is also with the Kama Sutra, which is coming out around the same time as Kalidasa. It's also Gupta period. And it reflects, it's a problematic text in some respects, but it's not quite as racy as, people would have imagined the Kama Sutra to be. And it does have some fascinating kind of dating advice. Essentially, I think the Kama Sutra can be best described in certain parts as a pickup manual. It's telling you how to pick up women and men. And it just gives us these kind of insights into human nature and into what will attract a woman to a man or a man to a woman. And here, actually, I found it quite profound, and I'd like to read out this bit. And this is from A.N.D. Hux's translation. The man who can inspire love for himself in a girl by increasing her self-respect and winning her confidence will be very dear to her. But the one who will neglect a girl, considering her to be too shy, she despises as a beast, who cannot comprehend her, or, unmindful of her feelings, one who forces himself on a girl, will plunge her forthwith in a state of fear, alarm, regret, and hate. And again, to bring back that point that in some ways what Kalidasa is talking about with Kumārasambhava is far more consensual than anything that our modern age is giving us. So in this respect also the Kama Sutra, by talking about a woman's self-respect and confidence and emphasizing that as the best means to win the affections of a woman is, I think, also deeply respectful and profound. unfortunately, we've come to the point where we're living in a society where people force themselves on women all the time. And I think that way, returning to the epics and really having this discussion about the ways they talk about sex and intimacy can be profound, can be transformative in that respect.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that advice directed towards men is sort of incorporating this, fairly forcefully, which is, I find it quite interesting, especially with regard to the authorship. So is there any question of authorship in Kama Sutra? Was it actually written by different people? Were the female authors, in the picture at all for this particular text?
I'm not too sure of the answer to that. I don't know about female authors, but there seems to be a consensus because the Kama Sutra seems to be one of many different love manuals that existed around the same time. So it reflects a very cosmopolitan ideal of love, and you'll find other aspects of it reflected elsewhere. I remember teaching parts of the Kama Sutra with some of my college students, and then we read that side by side with Kalidasa Shakuntala. And what's fascinating about both is that there's a very specific formula that the Kama Sutra lays out for talking about, discussing, expressing desire, and moving towards a relationship, which will involve, telling a friend or telling a maid who will then act as a go-between. And Shakuntala follows that as well. So it's this, how do we say it, this formula for romance that existed in that time seems to also, be reflected in the Kama Sutra and in the literature of that time period. In the same way that, today's kind of formula for romance, which is sort of going on 3 dates and then deciding you're going to get physical, or going on 5 dates and deciding whatever, or having your define the relationship talk. These are all formulas for romance that seem to, that are structures that we talk, that stories talk about, that mediate the way we pursue relationships. That way, the Kama Sutra, just to answer your question, is one of many things that reflects a kind of cosmopolitan ideal of love at that time.
Right. I find it so interesting that you are contrasting it to how people would respond now, because I think if anybody wrote the Kama Sutra now, it could be widely regarded as obscene and probably again sort of labeled as pornography more or less automatically.
Yes. And I'm actually thinking of the other text that is kind of in some ways an interesting companion read to the Kama Sutra, which is Ovid's Arts of Love, which again it's again a kind of a pickup manual. And that was hugely scandalous in its time. So much so that debate about the subject, but Ovid was actually exiled because of that text, because it was so scandalous. Yeah, and died had a hard time in life. Yes.
This knee-jerk response towards, calling something pornography reminds me of the distinction that the writer Garth Greenwell made between the two. So he was trying to actually say there is a difference here between literature and pornography. In the sense that porn is a very unartistic thing that is focused on making you feel a very single response, right? Which is typically arousal. But in literature, you see that the reader ends up having a much more complicated response. And in fact, that is the goal of the writer. It is not, their intention is to make you consider things that you haven't really considered before. And so one example of a complicated response, I think, is probably this epic poem that was written by Muddu Palani. Right? She was a courtesan at the court of Pratap Singh, who was a Maratha king of Tanjavur. And this was around the 18th century. And she has written this fairly lovely epic poem called Radhika Santva Namu, which essentially translates into appeasing Radhika. And it is a love poem involving Krishna, his senior wife Radha, and his new wife Ila. And so much of it is from the perspective, very interestingly, of Radha, or the elder wife, and it gives you verses distilled through the sensibility of an older woman who's facing a younger rival for the love of her husband. And again, this was a text that was banned later by the British. They labeled it as obscene, not unsurprisingly. And right after the wedding, what I found interesting is a scene where, the women are teasing Ila about how she will face her husband in the bedroom. Sort of, she will be, with Krishna for the first time. And there is this whole set of verses where they're, essentially ribbing her. And if they go something like this, so how will the lips of this young girl suffer his bites? He's the killer of the demon Kaitaba. How will her breasts bear his clawing? He's a lion of a cowherd. Can her tender thighs take his vigor? He wrestled Chanura to the death. Will her smooth body survive? He's an elephant killer. So in response to all this teasing, Ila's face is sort of turning red, and Radha draws her close and is trying to comfort her, giving her advice and so on. And she tells Ila, so when your husband holds you, push him gently with your breasts. If he kisses your cheek, touch his lips with yours. And when he gets on top of you, move against him from below. And if he gets tired while making love, quickly take over and get on top. So she's reassuring her, trying to, make her less fearful. But when Ila is finally about to leave to go meet Krishna, she sort of grabs Ila's pallu and she's unable to let go. And at this point, Ila has to turn around and sort of disengage her hands from her pallu and reassure her in return, telling her, don't worry, I'll be back soon. And she disappears. So you see what is essentially a conflicted woman who is, she wants to like the younger wife and sees her as somebody who needs to be protected. But at the same time, she's very conflicted about the fact that Krishna is going to sleep with another woman. And so when she's later in her room alone, she's thinking to herself that, you can give money, you can give away your own family, you can even give away your life. That isn't easy to give up. But to give your own husband to another woman, what woman can do that? And it's so interesting because this whole thing is written from the perspective of a female poet, and she brings together the point of view of an older woman, which is very rarely seen in these kind of, treatments around sex and love and jealousy and so on. And it lets you see that complicated response, I think, that Garth Greenwell was talking about, right? A narrator who feels so many different things at the same time when her husband has decided to marry another woman.
That is searing. And what a complicated character.
Very much so.
Yeah, you're feeling jealousy, but there's this deep generosity in her when she's actually giving Ila all of this advice on how to go into the sex act. Then that's a kind of a motherly role as well. So, wow, and that she's easing the act between her husband and this younger woman.
Exactly, making it easier for both of them, essentially.
Yeah, and then, what you were saying sometime earlier, that, sex is not actually, it's an act between two people, but it's mediated by all these memories and all of the instructions that come from generations otherwise. So actually you have two people in a bed, but then you have everybody else also who has influenced them in some fashion there with them. So that changes what intimacy actually is. But I just love this idea of Radhika as well. Being this woman who's sort of forced to be generous and in her response. I think we have so much to learn from that, because I see so many relationships in our present time are about jealousy and those kinds of, when you read something like The Appeasement of Radhika, to come back at it into these sort of monogamous relationships that we live in today with a sense of generosity from seeing how a sort of a polyamorous or a polygamous society dealt with it. This can be profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And that jealousy is not necessarily a derailing emotion in this particular case. She's basically sort of tightrope walking through her jealousy and also, trying to be understanding and trying to be loving at the same time, which I find a very interesting balance. Because you see so many stories where the jealousy becomes debilitating and sort of determines, and a justification in many ways to destroy a relationship and so on. So this is a slightly different perspective, which I found interesting.
And also what's fascinating about this is a woman's voice talking about sex and love triangles. How many of these women's voices do we have?
Yeah, not so many, right? Because don't you think, I'm not trying to discredit a male writer, but don't you think it's possible that if a male writer was writing this, Radha would be much more rageful as a character and much less likely to, be giving Ila any advice? So that was interesting.
The other text I was thinking about when you were reading that was another ancient Greek text, which is Longus's Daphnis and Chloe. And in both what you just read out and in Daphnis and Chloe, there's this aspect of sex education. Radhika has to kind of educate Ila in sex. She has to tell her how to deal with it, what to do. And we don't have these conversations so much anymore. I don't think mothers and daughters or fathers and sons or anybody has these kinds of conversations about actually how to have sex. Whereas also in Daphnis and Chloe are in love with each other, but neither of them have ever had sex before. So for that, there is another character introduced who's this woman who's intent on seducing Daphnis, and Daphnis has sex with her, but the whole point of the sexual act is to educate him in how to have sex so that when he has sex with Chloe, he's a far more considerate lover.
How interesting. Oh my God.
These love triangles. The other thing that I was thinking about when you were reading out Mudapalani, and Mudapalani is what, 17th, 18th century? 18th century.
18th century, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And it's to go back, to this. I have this verse that I love from the Atharva Veda, and I'm convinced that a woman wrote it, though I don't know. We don't talk so much about women's voices and experiences. But again, you have this woman's experience of what passion comes out. This is written in the BCs, but just to read it out. This is the Apsara's love spell, the conquering, resistless ones. Send the spell forth, ye deities, let him consume with love of me. I pray, may he remember me, think of me, loving and beloved. Send forth the spell, ye deities, let him consume with love of me, that he may think of me, that I may never, never think of him. Send forth the spell, ye deities, let him consume with love of me. Madden him, Maruts, madden him, madden him, madden him, O air. Madden him, Agni, madden him, let him consume with love of me. And again, here is this aspect of passion, which is maddening, which is also one-upmanship. This person who's writing this wants her lover to think of her and be consumed by thoughts of her, but doesn't want to think of him, so that she has the one-up on him. And if you ask me, this is certainly written by a woman. I cannot imagine. It seems to me to really of a young woman in love, maybe an older woman in love as well. But this all-consuming passion, this infatuation.
Yeah, that is a very youthful desire almost, right? To be desired in that way.
Yes, that I may never think of him. Yes. This is like invoking my 14-year-old self. But the other woman's voice that I find really interesting is Andal's, which is coming millennia after this, coming in the 8th century AD. And again, that's a really interesting way of talking about sex. And this time, but she's using sex to decode her relationship with God. So the problems of sex, the jealousy of it, the games of it, the power. I mean, I think the Atharva Veda is also talking about passion as power over someone else. All of these things kind of come to, kind of boiling pitch with this. And this is from Priya Sarukai Chabria's translation, just before I read it. And this is it. Tell my deceitful Lord he's relished my body's angry fruit and the seat of my being. He tricked, devoured, and discarded me. But I'm no pip. Make him take me again. Again, like Radhika, the appeasement of Radhika, this is a woman who wants sex as well.
Right, yeah. And also it's sort of like a futile situation because he's always unattainable and she's always the one who's pleading with him, essentially, no?
Yeah, and he's tricking her and he's devouring her and he's seducing her. It's a complicated relationship.
So how do you think this works in the sense of, say, if we see the writer as the person who is left behind? Is that the sort of tone across these verses that you're talking about?
What do you mean by writer as a person who's left behind?
So she's the one who, he comes, seduces her and then leaves ultimately every single time.
In some cases, yeah.
So the power is in this case with the god who she's sort of, working to like win his love constantly. And the earlier one also you talked about the power equation. Can you tell me a little more about that part?
Oh, well, I think the idea, we've also come with this understanding, I think, in previous generations that sex has some sort of relationship with power. And the idea of, let him consume with love of me, that he may think of me, that I may never think of him. I think that's really about shifting a power relationship, that this woman feels powerless and submissive and like her power is being taken away from her because of this passion. Through this him, she's trying to bring it back to her. And how much of these are also games that I think people still play in terms of love. You show more interest or the other party shows more interest and then sex becomes so much about power.
Yeah, I think this is probably something we don't talk about enough in the sense of how much sex is intertwined with who has the power in the relationship, right? To a large extent, and how that sort of plays out and sort of overflows into other aspects of the relationship as well. So, okay, I have to admit I'm a little interested in this because I've been reading a fair amount of like gay-themed literature over the past several months. In fact, the writer that I mentioned earlier, Garth Greenwell, is also a gay writer. He's written a couple of very lovely books on gay relationships and so on, fictionalized. And so I think one of the reasons I find it so interesting and so different is because I think it does not really feel the need to appeal to a broader audience. So it tends to be both more frank and more brutal. And I don't know if this is because of the fact that these characters represent people who've been pushed into the closet for so long, and they've been waiting to burst it open, and therefore they, tend to be more honest and about their sexual experience, in the sense they want people to know it in all of its rawness, essentially. So there was this Indian writer that I was reading recently. So I think this is more in the modern literature side of things, Hansda, Sorendra, Shekhar. So his book, My Father's Garden, was nominated for the JCB Prize, and he writes about sex in a way that I think is really interesting in terms of the power equation between two men in bed. Because when it's two men in bed, then that whole sort of, relative strength between a man and a woman, sex in a patriarchal society, all of that sort of go out of the window. And this is two individuals negotiating it between themselves, right? And what I find so interesting is that the narrator in this book is clearly submissive, and the one-sidedness of the kind of sex he has keeps sort of changing his relationships with the people he has it with. So, for example, he has a friend in college with whom he starts having sex, and when they start doing it, their friendship essentially changes fairly dramatically. For example, there is this bit in which the narrator writes that the sex changed all things, and how they no longer discuss their favorite movie makers like Rituparna Ghosh, and how he no longer read him passages from the stories he wrote or from the books he purchased. Basically, his friend was no longer interested in him in any other way besides as a sexual object. And there are these, in fact, the book starts off very explicitly. Humiliating sex is in the book's very first chapter. And you see that the rawness of it shows the narrator at, he's very demeaned in those experiences. And that sort of leads us to understand how his relationships fall apart in the chapters that follow. He, on the other hand, is constantly in fear of being rejected. So there is this part in which the narrator is talking about his constant need to please. Like he writes, I would apply Johnson's baby oil on the parts he would soon touch, spray deodorant on my neck, and chew 2 chewing gum so that my breath would be sweet. And I find it so interesting here that the intersections for the narrator are many, in the sense that he finds himself marginalized in multiple ways, right? 1, because he's gay. 2, because he comes from a tribal community. And 3, because he feels very deeply alienated from his family because his father suspects that he's gay but won't actually say it out loud, but he doesn't have his approval. So the sex scenes essentially distill all his humiliations for us in a very sort of clear way. And it is both very painful to read and very illuminating as well.
Wow, that is profound. I mean, I'm also thinking that when you were saying that we bring all of ourselves also to the sexual act, it's all of your aspects of you cannot divide or compartmentalize. All of those aspects also sort of create the physicality of it too. That sense of humiliation, that sense of worthlessness that you feel elsewhere in your life will also translate into the bedroom.
Yes, absolutely. And I wonder if somebody's talked about a relationship or written a story about a relationship where somebody starts up with the upper hand and the sexual relationship sort of changes that around completely. I'm sure there are stories about that, but I think it's an interesting dynamic that probably happens more often than we realize.
Yeah. And I'm actually thinking when you were reading this, Devi, and we were also talking earlier that male writers and the kind of representations of sex in a lot of male writing, particularly what we've got inherited from kind of a Eurocentric Western literary canon. What really challenges this do you think it is gay voices? Do you think it's women's voices? Is it possible for a man writing a heterosexual novel to kind of challenge these perspectives on sex?
That's very interesting, because I think through the late 80s and early 90s, there were a bunch of American writers who were celebrated for writing interestingly about sex, right? Like John Updike and so on, right? But from this perspective, if you read about them now, if you read the discussions about them now, they're sort of talked about as dead white men, almost as if their descriptions are irrelevant. So I'm not entirely sure whether that's the case, but at least in my experience, I have seen that some of the more radical writing that is coming about sex is definitely gay writers, and probably women writers to some extent, who are exploring gay themes and bisexuality and polyamory and stuff like that. So yeah, maybe you could say that male writers in this decade have a little bit of catching up to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking when you're talking about that of 2 novels that I've read. I mean, Henry Miller, and I'm also thinking of Nabokov in Lolita. And again, you have these. Lolita is a complicated novel, but we're also living in a time when the representation of beauty is so largely skewed towards young, and our models today look like prepubescent girls. And Henry Miller, I remember trying to read that and being kind of scarred by his descriptions of sex. But because they were these kind of over-the-top literary flourishes that were also so much intertwined with kind of demonstrations of masculinity in a kind of way.
While at the same time very shamelessly describing women. I remember it's in an almost, makes them seem abject to some extent, is what I thought.
Both abject and objectified.
Yeah, very much so.
And I was remembering something you were telling me about what you encountered in a writing seminar, and how that representation of sex, of a woman thinking about sex, could actively change who we also think is having sex.
You're talking about the older woman, talking about like hers. So there were a range of, I think, people as part of the seminar, and it was a very frank and freewheeling discussion. So I think she felt bold enough to ask a question about whether there was any sort of sex scene depicted that involved breast milk, for example. And I was thinking about it, and I do know that Philip Roth has scenes involving urine, but breast milk was completely new and clearly came from her sort of very specific experience, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think that we also have to broaden, when we talk about sex in literature, it can also work in that way to broaden our understanding of what beauty is, or what aesthetics are, of body positivity in a certain kind of way. Especially when you read these Regency romances, everyone is having these perfect bodies. And this is not the reality that most of us are living with. The way also these bodies act in sex are perfect, which is not also true. I mean, with the breast milk example. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone has a perfect tan. Everyone's legs go on for miles. That is true, yeah.
So to challenge these things, to question these things, I think is can make us more accepting of ourselves in many respects too.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that talking about sex in Indian epics was so interesting with you was that there is this disconnect, right, that we were discussing early on that's happened. I think we have a sort of broken chain when it comes to Indians and how we approach sex. And perhaps maybe talking about these stories more, talking about these scenes more can help us reconnect that. Because otherwise, I think the narrative is so much driven by this idea of sanskar and how women should behave that is sort of dominating the conversation right now. And it's deeply frustrating to see it because Indian culture was so multicolored and has so many variants to it that it's very difficult to just sort of distill it into one word called sanskar and then use it to dictate how women should behave and what men should talk about and so on.
And also the kind of literary canon we lose out as respect, right? If we just talk about sanskar all the time, there's this huge volume of erotic literature that we just, which presents all these myriad voices, women's voices, that we lose out as a result.
Absolutely. We are just finishing the job that the Victorian bureaucrats started in that case. We are just damaging to ourselves, basically.
And just to move away from kind of Indian epics and to another kind of text that I find fascinating, because we've talked about Western literature, we've talked about Indian literature, but I'm also deeply fascinated by the Arabian Nights. And this is a text that I grew up thinking was a text for children, right? All of our stories, Aladdin and all of that, are coming from 1001 Nights. But then it's kind of shocking when you actually read it as an adult and you're like, oh, this is actually a deeply erotic text. And I think it has so much of a message for us today because it's the story brings all these themes together that we've been talking about, power and intimacy and the kind of transformation of character and the realization of the self that can happen through sex. And because it starts off with this sultan who is deeply unhappy because he's just discovered his wife has committed adultery and betrayed him. And so he's so angry that he kills her and he kills her lover. And after that, he just cannot trust again. And so he marries a woman night after night and, executes them in the morning. And while on one hand, this is a horrible thing to do, kill woman after woman. On the other, and there's, this huge lack of forgiveness. But on the other hand, you also, you can understand the pain of being betrayed. And this goes on for a while and suddenly there's this restlessness in the kingdom because every night these families have to send one daughter to marry the sultan. And so many families have lost one daughter and even two daughters. And it's finally the vizier whose job it is to find a woman to marry the sultan every night who just cannot find anyone to marry the sultan. And that's when, and he is now in danger of sort of losing his head. And that's when his daughter pipes up and says, "Father, marry me and marry me to the sultan." And the vizier is like, "What? No, I'm not going to give away my own daughter who's going to be killed the next morning." And she says, this is Shehrazad. She says, no, me and my sister Dunyazad, we've come up with a plan. We know exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to also, in this process, save and stop this murdering rampage of women throughout that's happening. And so she marries the Sultan, and she asks as a because she's going to die the next morning, let me bring my sister Dunyazad to also be there in the bedchamber with us on my last night on this planet. And the Sultan, a little bit of him is also feeling, okay, says, okay, fine, yeah, do that. And so this is so bizarre. It's Shehrazad and the Sultan in the bedchamber and Dunyazad hiding under the bed. And after Shehrazad and the Sultan have, consummated their marriage, which is when Dunyazad pipes up and says, sister, tell me a story. I don't know what I'm going to do without your stories. Please tell me a story on this last night of yours. And that's when she starts telling a story. And the Sultan also gets hooked into the act of storytelling. And she doesn't finish it by the morning. But he's so eager to hear the ending of the story that he lets her live another night and another night and another night. And also what's fascinating is the content of these stories. Often they feature men who have been betrayed by their wives, or who think they have been betrayed, or acts of sexual transgression. And she normalizes them. She also normalizes them through the figure of this other, the Caliph of Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, who emerges from the stories as this sort of great soul who is this great leader who is forgiveness and understanding and justice all into one. And she's sort of, through these stories, providing a mirror for the Sultan to understand what's happened to him, this act of betrayal, and to see examples of forgiveness and normalize it, but also providing this example of this great ruler whose virtues also transform the Sultan. So after 1,001 Nights, when Scheherazade has finally run out of stories, the Sultan has fallen in love with her and lets her live. And I found this is it's a story of transformation, of using intimacy, of using sex, of using all of these things as a way of transforming character. It gives me kind of hope, especially in these times when I think the moment we're living in, we're seeing so many, there is no healthy sexuality out there, and these things have to be healed. So can storytelling do that?
Yeah, I think that's what's so beautiful about this, right? It's basically talking about the transformative power of literature and storytelling, in the sense that the version of the Sultan almost before stories and after stories kind of thing, presenting him with a idealized version of himself that he could potentially aspire to in story after story until he essentially becomes that. I think that is amazing.
Yeah, it's like a spiritual makeover.
Pretty much. And don't you think that was something which is what our ancients were aiming at with all those things, with the Kama Sutra, with those epic poems and so on? You're essentially modeling a kind of behavior, a way to love for people to some extent, no? Without that, we're sort of out in the wilderness, sort of trapped in ourselves without any reference points. So we're lost without it to a large extent.
Yeah, I think also the way that stories talk about sex, I think, can civilize us. I'm starting to think of Epic of Gilgamesh now, where you have Enkidu, who is running with the wild beasts and is this beast man who talks to the animals and frees all the animals from their traps, and how Gilgamesh has to civilize him by introducing him to this beautiful prostitute who then, and once he has been with this prostitute for 6 days or 7 days or whatever, the animals no longer recognize him. And I'm also wondering if that's what we do through stories.
It's so fascinating because it's one of the oldest epics around, right? And it immediately goes there towards the healing nature and the transformative nature.
Yes. And we're losing that out in these times. How do you see stories transforming this? Because we are living in times where our discussions, our representations of sex, they're also problematic and deeply wounded. I mean, look at sorry to bring Cardi B into this, but that is disturbing. How do we shift these things? How do we transform them? So
I'm a little optimistic about this, maybe, foolishly optimistic. But I do think that if we keep on telling stories, and I've seen that, a lot of people complain about the distracting power of things like Facebook and Twitter and all of that. But I've seen writers sort of shaping storytelling into these mediums as well. For example, you see a lot more webcomics. You see a lot more very interesting narratives that are woven into the thread format on Twitter. And and you see interesting things on Instagram stories. So I'm always hopeful that good narratives sort of win over bad narratives. Maybe not in the short term, but in the longer term. At least that's what I hope for. Like, Obama says the arc of history bends towards justice. The arc of storytelling bends towards better quality.
We hope.
Yeah.
Sam, Devi, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion and for continuously helping us by pushing the envelope of the range of our discussions that we have on BIC streams and BIC Talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavan.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.